Welcome to Pave's Garage. In this video, we're finally going to make the Carbon Kevlar roof for the Pajero Evo. Now this video isn't quite what I'd call a tutorial. It's close, but I'm really not that good. If you're looking for a really good tutorial by professionals, check out the Easy Composites videos on how to make a carbon fibre bonnet. I've got all the materials here, which I purchased from playwithcarbon.com, who are a really good supplier of carbon fibring materials in Australia. Yeah, we're just going to cut to voiceover now and see how we turn all of this into a roof. This big blue thing is a mould I created using an old Pajero roof. If you want to see how that's made, I do it in the previous video. The first step is to put some vacuum sealant tape around the outside of the mould. This is what holds the vacuum bag down to the mould, creating an airtight seal. Next I'm going to lay down the first of the two release agents, being a mould release wax. I just do this in a few layers, buffing and polishing it off in between each coat. The reason I've put this down after putting the vacuum bagging tape on is to ensure that the vacuum bagging tape gets a good seal onto the part. The next layer is some PVC release agent, which is just sprayed on using an ordinary paint spray gun. Ideally you want the gun settings to be at a point where you just get an extremely fine mist coming out. I probably had it a little bit too thick in this case. Now comes the exciting part where I start cutting and sizing the fabric. It's a good idea when you're cutting fabric to lay down some masking tape over it, just so you don't get any frayed edges. The material I'm using is a 2x2 twill carbon Kevlar weave, which doesn't come in widths wide enough for me to actually be able to cover the entire roof with a single piece of cloth, meaning I've got to have a seam on it somewhere. I was hoping to be able to trim the edge of the material and just sort of butt it together to get a nice V-weave going, but unfortunately Kevlar is just too damn tough to cut, even with my Kevlar shears, to have a clean cut. So what I've ended up deciding to do is just to lay one bit of material sort of over the top of the other, and I'll just be left with a bit of an ugly yellow line through the centre of the part, but I'm okay with that because it's function over form. And now with the help of my lovely assistant, I'm just very daintily laying down the Kevlar, trying to position it exactly in the centre of the roof. Which on a roof with curves and contours and isn't the same width all the way through is not an easy job. But with it lined up perfectly, I spray down a bit of clear spray adhesive and lay the first piece of cloth down. The next thing I'm doing is using some spray adhesive and a small squeegee to really force all the fabric into the corners of the mould. This is a really important step because if you don't do this, sometimes the fabric can sort of bridge through the corner of the mould, meaning that you end up with some pretty bad air bubbles on the corners of the final piece. Next up is the first of the two carbon fibre backing layers, just using a standard carbon 2x2 twill. This next layer is a Soric core material, which is a really good way of adding some strength and some thickness to your part without using multiple layers of carbon fibre. It only costs about $15 a metre, so it's extremely cost effective. With that all cut into size across the skin of the roof, I just lay down some carbon fibre tape around the outside, just adding a little bit more reinforcement around the edges, which will really help add to the strength of the part. And over the top of all that goes the final carbon fibre backing layer, and once again I go to a lot of time and effort to make sure that it's really pushed into all the corners, which will help eliminate any bridging on the final part. So one of the most difficult things to get right with vacuum resin fusion moulding is actually getting a good vacuum on your part. Just any one of these little tiny strands, if that makes a bridge from inside the mold to the outside, that can cause a vacuum leak. And when you're trying to trace down just one little tiny, almost invisible strand of carbon fibre to find a vacuum leak, it is just about impossible. So what I'm going to do is just put some spray glue all around the edges, And I think that will help glue down any of the fraying edges and probably prevent that from happening. Now, before making this piece, I've made probably 10 to 15 carbon fibre pieces, and honestly the majority of them have been failures because I failed to get a good vacuum over the system. So that's why I'm really spending this extra time to minimise the risk of getting any vacuum leaks as far as possible. The next layer which goes over all of that is some release cloth. This is essentially like a non-stick fabric which will stop all the carbon fibre layers from sticking to all the layers which have to go on top of that. And the next thing which goes on is some infusion mesh which helps the resin flow all the way through the part evenly. And off camera, I put in some of that spiral tubing there, which you can see, which again helps the resin flow through the part. And the final layer before the vacuum bag is another layer of release cloth, which I found just helps prevent the infusion mesh from puncturing through and creating a vacuum leak in the vacuum bag. And finally the bag is being stuck down onto the original vacuum sealant tape, and I'm just adding a few pleats in there which will ensure that the bag has enough slack to really be uniformly sucked down into the entire part. Right, so we're now ready to perform a vacuum drop test on this. And a vacuum drop test is just pulling a vacuum on it and then leaving it for probably 10, 20, 30 minutes or so, and just seeing if you have any vacuum leaks. I'm doing this through the catch pot, which has a vacuum gauge on it. And the first thing I'm going to do is isolate the catch pot using these hose clamps and just test this is actually holding a good vacuum before we go and try this. And you'll see that I isolated the vacuum pump as well, because sometimes the vacuum pumps, ironically, aren't that great at holding a vacuum, especially my old one. Alright, it's been about 15 minutes or so, and I'm pretty satisfied that we've got no leaks in this system. So now we're going to connect this into there. So this first hose is going to be the vacuum hose which actually draws the resin all the way through the part, and any excess resin will be drawn into that catch pot rather than being drawn into the vacuum pump. And on the other side of the mould I'll have a resin inlet coming in through a hose as well, which will be where the resin gets drawn in through from. And now it's time to perform the vacuum drop test on the mould. Straight away after drawing the vacuum, I could hear the hissing of air being drawn in through multiple places. So I had to go around really pinching the vacuum bag onto the tape to really ensure that any of those hisses had stopped. And even after you do stop the leaks, which you can hear, there's likely to be quite a few more which you don't hear. So you've really just got to go around really mushing the vacuum bag against the vacuum tape and against the mould, especially in areas where there's any folds or creases in the bag. So we've just left this for about half an hour now. I'm going to take off this hose clamp, and if that needle moves, that means we've got a vacuum leak somewhere. If it doesn't move, we're good to go. You have no idea how difficult it is to get that to happen. So I'm just about to mix up the resin, and one thing I didn't consider before I started doing this is that I might need a fair bit of resin. The calculations I've done based on some charts online say that I'm going to need somewhere between 2 and 2.5 litres of resin for this, and I've only got 1 litre mixing cups. So I'm just going to mix up a few batches in this and then sacrifice my fruit bowl here.
Give her a nice fruit bowl.
and suck all the resin out of this, because you don't want to be swapping the tube from between different resin pots as you're drawing in, because otherwise that'll just get air into the part and defeat the whole purpose of doing vacuum bagging in the first place. So we're going to start mixing it.
Oh god.
And this gets extra confusing because I need 2 to 2.5 litres, but you mix it all by weight. So I don't really know how much weight is going to equate to that 2 to 2.5 litres. There we go. So that is 800 grams. That means I'm going to need 25 to 100, which means I'm going to need 200 mils. 200 grams. Not mils. Because mils is volume.
Quick math.
Quick math. I hope I've got enough hard enough. Oh god, yeah, you're really supposed to have a gas mask on for this stuff.
Uh-oh.
With my girlfriend thoroughly impressed with my competence at this complex task, I decided to impress her even more by using a champagne bucket as a vacuum chamber to draw out any air bubbles that were left in the resin. This is a really important step to do before drawing the resin into your vacuumized part, as any small bubbles in the resin will grow exponentially larger when they're drawn under vacuum inside the part you're trying to infuse. And this is probably the most satisfying part of the whole process, watching the resin slowly get drawn in. This took a lot longer than I was expecting, probably because I'm using the extra layer of the release cloth over the top of my infusion mesh. But I got there eventually before the resin hardened. And with everything all nice and wet, I left it overnight and came back to it the next day to demold it. The whole demolding process for this piece took almost an hour. You've really just got to find a corner or somewhere where you can just lift the mold a little bit, and I just find sticking paddle pop sticks in is probably the best way to at least begin getting the part unstuck. But on this piece, I was able to get the rear of the piece out pretty easily, but the front where all the extra curving is, it just took me forever to get out. But eventually. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Look at this. It bloody worked. Oh yeah. Few imperfections in the weave along this front edge, but a couple of little tiny air gaps in here right in the corner. It's a really difficult spot to get right, but man, I'm so happy with how that's turned out. Alright, now I'm going to trim it. Now, carbon fibre dust is horrendously bad for both your lungs and electric motors. So I'm going to have to hold this rather awkwardly while simultaneously vacuuming it up out of the air. Standard carbon fibre can be cut with just about any standard Dremel cutting wheel, but in the case of Carbon Kevlar, that'll blunt the bits extremely quickly. So I'm opting to use a diamond cutting wheel, which cuts through the Kevlar with ease. So for a first attempt at doing a piece this big, which is actually going to end up on the Evo, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. Obviously this big line down the centre is a bit ugly and the weave at the front got a bit messed up, but it'll work. That being said, I'm probably going to have to end up painting the roof because there are some legal questions around whether or not a carbon fibre roof is allowed on cars in Australia. So to play it safe, I'll probably paint it and hope that whoever's doing the inspection eventually doesn't notice it. But the carbon fibre / carbon Kevlar bonnet will be good to go. I don't really think I've got anything else valuable to say, if you can consider anything I say valuable. So I think I'll go do some editing. Maybe upload this. Maybe like 2 videos in a year. Maybe 3 videos this year on YouTube. This thing will be done by the end of the year, I promise.